Some stories never die. They linger, decade after decade, whispering through old newspapers and fading photographs. And in West Virginia, there's one story that's haunted people for nearly 80 years. Christmas Eve 1945. A house fire tears through the Sodder family home. 5 children vanish in the flames, except no bodies were ever found. The fire department showed up 7 hours late. The phones were cut. The ladder was missing. And what happened next turned a tragedy into one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in American history. This is the case of the Sodder children, the family that lost everything except their questions. And to understand why this case still refuses to die, you have to go back to that night itself. The Sodder family should have remembered that night for nothing more than laughter and gifts. It was Christmas Eve, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Inside their home, George and Jenny Sodder were gathered with 9 of their 10 children. The war had just ended. They had each other. And for a few hours, the world was simple. Marion, the oldest daughter at 19, walked through the door carrying packages from the dime store where she worked. She handed them to her younger sisters, Martha, 12, Jenny, 8, and Betty, just 5. Their eyes lit up. New toys, a Christmas surprise. The little ones were so excited they begged to stay up late. And Jenny, their mother, gave in, just this once. She told them they could play, as long as Maurice, 14, and Louis, 9, remembered to feed the chickens and bring in the cows before bed. One by one, the house quieted. George, tired from the day's work, was already asleep. His older sons, John and George Jr., had gone to bed too. Marion drifted off on the couch. Only the younger children were still awake, their laughter carrying faintly through the halls as Jenny carried 3-year-old Sylvia upstairs. But beneath the warmth of Christmas, something darker had been building. Not long before that night, a stranger had come to the Sodder home, an insurance salesman. When George refused to buy, the man snapped. He told George, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed." Then he added something else, that George would pay for the dirty remarks he'd been making about Benito Mussolini. George didn't hide his hatred for Mussolini. He'd argued about it in town before. But now, with that threat hanging in the air, it felt different. Apart from this, there is one more mysterious thing that happened before that night. Days before Christmas, the family noticed a man in a parked car. He wasn't moving. He wasn't leaving. He was just sitting there, watching their younger children as they walked home from school. All of it could have been coincidence. A salesman's temper, a stranger in a car. But put together, it felt like the night itself was holding its breath. Jenny would later remember how she gave the children one last reminder, then turned out the lights. These were the final moments of normal life inside the Sodder house, because within an hour, everything would burn. And then, just past midnight, the Sodders' ordinary Christmas turned into the kind of nightmare you never wake up from. At 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. The house was quiet, the kind of silence only a winter night can hold. Jenny shuffled downstairs, half asleep, and picked up the receiver. On the other end, a woman's voice she didn't recognize asked for someone Jenny had never heard of. Behind her, the faint clinking of glasses, laughter, almost like a party. Jenny told her she had the wrong number. But instead of hanging up, the woman laughed, a strange, unsettling laugh, before the line went dead. Jenny stood there for a moment, the empty hum of the dial tone filling her ear. Something about it felt wrong. She set the phone down and looked around the living room. The lights were still on. curtains were open. Two little details the children never forgot before bed. Marion, exhausted, had already dozed off on the couch, her new dime store gifts still tucked nearby. Jenny assumed the younger ones had gone upstairs to the attic where they usually slept. She turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and tried to shake off the unease. Then she went back to bed. An hour later, at 1 a.m., a new sound ripped through the quiet, a heavy thud on the roof, then a rolling noise like something bouncing and sliding across the shingles. Jenny froze, waiting for another noise to follow. When nothing came, she forced herself to lie back down. Maybe it was ice, maybe just her imagination. But at 1:30 a.m., she woke again. This time it wasn't sound, it was smell. Acrid, thick, unmistakable. Smoke. She bolted upright and saw it. Flame spreading through George's office downstairs, crawling quickly across the fuse box and the phone line. She shook George awake. He scrambled to his son's rooms, yelling for help. Chaos erupted instantly. Smoke filled the halls. The heat pressed in like a wall. They screamed for the children upstairs. No answer. The staircase, their only path to the attic, was already swallowed in fire. In minutes, the Sodder home had become a trap. Survival came first. The parents and four of the children, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., made it out into the freezing night air. The rest were still inside. George refused to stop. He smashed a window with his bare hands, his arm tearing open in the process. Blood ran down his wrist, but he didn't care. He tried to climb inside, but the flames were too strong. He turned to the ladder that always leaned against the side of the house, except it wasn't there. Later, he'd find it 75 feet away, shoved down a steep embankment. Panic set in. George sprinted to the water barrel to douse the fire, but the barrel was frozen solid, its surface hard as stone. No help there. In a last desperate frenzy, George and his sons ran for the family's trucks. If they could get close enough, they could climb onto the roof and smash through the attic window. Both trucks had worked flawlessly the day before, but now, with the children screaming inside, neither would start. Not even a cough from the engine, just silence. Every way in, gone. The Sodders could only stand outside, barefoot in the winter cold, watching helplessly as the fire devoured everything they owned. 45 minutes. That's all it took for the house to collapse in on itself, leaving nothing but glowing embers. Neighbors arrived, drawn by the flames lighting up the sky. Some tried to call the fire department, but the lines didn't connect. It would be nearly 8 in the morning, 7 hours later, before the fire crew finally showed up. By then, there was nothing left to save. Just ash, smoke, and silence where a family home had stood. And the 5 Sodder children, they were gone. When the flames finally died, the nightmare should have had an answer. But instead, it only got stranger. The fire chief told George and Jenny that the blaze had been so intense, it burned their children's bodies completely. Nothing left. But when the firefighters sifted through the ash, there were no bones, no skulls, nothing. The basement held appliances, tin roof fragments, even recognizable scraps of furniture, but not a single trace of 5 children. George couldn't bear it. 4 days later, he bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the site, turning it into a garden. Official investigators hadn't finished their work, but to George, there was nothing left to wait for. Now at that time, everything was pretty much simple and basic, and so the one and only investigation that followed ruled the fire was caused by faulty wiring. Case closed. But among the jurors was a familiar face. The the same insurance salesman who had threatened George weeks before, the man who had told him his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. That was the man now calling the fire an accident. By December 30th, death certificates were issued for all 5 missing children. The surviving Sodders were too broken to attend the funeral. Still, questions ate at them. If it was faulty wiring, why had the family's Christmas lights stayed on as the fire spread? If the children really burned, why were no remains in the ashes? And then there was the ladder. It wasn't lost in the fire. It wasn't even close. It was discovered 75 feet away, tossed into a ditch. The phone line too. Investigators proved it hadn't burned. It had been cut. Someone had climbed the pole and sliced it in the dead of night. And the trucks George tried to use to reach the attic, both had worked perfectly the day before. That night, neither engine would turn over. One by one, the explanations didn't add up. What was supposed to be a tragic accident was beginning to look like something else entirely. And the deeper the Sodders looked, the less the official story made sense. Jenny, desperate for answers, started her own experiments. She burned piles of animal bones in the stove, testing if they could ever be reduced to nothing. They never were. She even spoke to a local crematorium worker who told her flat out, human bones remain even after hours at 2000 degrees. The Sodder fire hadn't burned nearly that hot or that long. Yet somehow, 5 children had supposedly vanished into thin air. Other witnesses added fuel to the mystery. A bus driver passing by on Christmas Eve swore he saw people throwing balls of fire at the Sodder home. Months later, when the snow melted, Sylvia, the youngest, found a small green rubber-like object in the yard. George recognized it immediately. It looked like a pineapple bomb, the same kind of hand grenade used in combat. Suddenly, Jenny's memory of a thud on the roof didn't seem so harmless. And then came the sightings. One woman claimed she saw the children looking out from a car as the house burned behind them. Another said she served them breakfast at a rest stop the very next morning, the children traveling with strangers in a car with Florida plates. Even the town's whispers took a darker turn. The Sodders heard a rumor that the fire chief had secretly found a heart in the ashes. George confronted him, and Morris admitted it. He led them to the spot, where they dug up a small metal box. Inside wasn't a heart at all. It was a piece of fresh beef liver, completely untouched by fire. Morris later admitted he had buried it himself, hoping the family would find it and give up the search. But George and Jenny weren't giving up. Not after everything they'd seen. Not with rumors spreading that the Sicilian mafia might have been involved. Maybe to extort George, maybe to punish him for his outspoken views. In Fayetteville, everyone was talking that the children hadn't died in the fire. They'd been taken. And for the Sodders, that theory was starting to feel like the only one that fit. By now, the Sodders weren't just fighting grief. They were fighting the system itself. George begged for federal help, writing directly to the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover himself responded, and while he admitted he'd like to help, he shut the door. Unless local authorities officially asked, the Bureau wouldn't step in. Fayetteville's police and fire departments refused, so the Sodders were left on their own. In 1949, George managed to bring in Oscar Hunter, a respected pathologist from Washington, D.C., to supervise a new excavation of the site. The dig turned up coins, a burned dictionary, and most chilling of all, bone fragments. At first, it seemed like the break they had been waiting for. But when the bones were examined at the Smithsonian, The truth was devastating. They weren't from children at all. The fragments came from a 16 to 22-year-old, too old to be any of the Sodder kids. Even stranger, the bones hadn't been burned, not even scorched. The conclusion? They had likely come from a cemetery, somehow mixed into the dirt George had bulldozed over the site. How they got there, or why, was never explained. By then, the case had captured national attention. In 1950, the West Virginia legislature held hearings on the Sodder mystery. For a moment, it looked like there might be a breakthrough, but instead, the governor and state police declared the case hopeless. They closed it at the state level. The FBI gave it one last look, calling it a potential interstate kidnapping. For 2 years, they followed every lead, every rumor, every sighting, and every single one collapsed into nothing. By the early 50s, even the FBI walked away. To the outside world, the Sodder case was dead. But inside the family, it was only getting started. The officials may have walked away, but the Sodders never did. George and Jenny launched their own campaign, plastering flyers across the country and offering a $5,000 reward for any clue. Then came the most famous symbol of their fight, a massive billboard along Route 16. For decades it stood over the highway, 5 young faces staring back at every passing car, the words begging for answers. Now, due to these posters and flyers, multiple tips poured in. Like for instance, in 1952, a hotel owner in Charleston claimed she'd seen the children a week after the fire. She remembered them arriving near midnight with 2 men and 2 women, all speaking Italian. When she tried to talk to the kids, one of the men glared at her and barked something in Italian. The group left before sunrise. George followed every lead: Missouri, Texas, Florida. He chased down names, rumors, and whispered sightings, only to run into dead ends. Then in 1967, something arrived in the mail that stopped the family cold. A plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a man in his 30s. On the back, scrawled words: Louis Sodder. I love Brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132 or 35 Lewis would have been in his 30s. The resemblance was very much similar to Louis. The Sodders hired a private investigator to track it down. He vanished without a trace. The Kentucky lead went nowhere, but the photo stayed. Jenny enlarged it, framed it, and hung it above the fireplace. For her, it was proof. Louis was alive. George didn't live long enough to see anything more. He died in 1969, worn down by years of searching. Jenny carried the burden alone. She dressed in black for the rest of her life. She tended the flower garden where her house had once stood, and every day she kept that billboard up, a silent demand for justice towering over Route 16 until 1989, when she also finally died. After Jenny's death, the surviving Sodder children refused to let the case die. They carried the story into newspapers, interviews, even online forums. Generation after generation, the mystery lived on. The world might have moved on, but for the Sodders, the question never changed. If their children didn't die in the fire, then where had they gone? For decades, the Sodder case has lived in that uneasy space between tragedy and conspiracy. Some people say the children died in the fire, and the chaos of that night left nothing to find. But here's the problem. Fires don't erase people, not completely. Even at crematorium heat, bones remain. And in the Sodder ruins, there were appliances, roofing, furniture, but no skeletons. Not even fragments that match the children. If they really burned, then at least some trace should have been there. A skull, a rib, something. But there was nothing. Unless, of course, everyone was so incompetent they managed to miss it all. The firefighters, the pathologists, even after excavation. Either the remains weren't there, or no one wanted to admit what was. Theories keep multiplying. Mafia ties, kidnapping, a cover-up. Maybe the kids were taken overseas. Maybe they lived full lives in silence, always knowing their family was still searching. The Sodders never agreed. John, one of the surviving sons, begged the family to move on, but Jenny never did. Dressed in black for the rest of her life, she tended her garden and kept the billboard standing as if her missing children might walk through the door at any moment. And now, decades later, the case refuses to die. Every book, every documentary, every online theory always circles back to the same question. 5 children vanished on Christmas Eve, 1945. If they didn't burn, then where did they go?